All right, I think we'll get started. Hello, everybody. I'm Ben, and I'm the Chief Planning Officer at the Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West New Jersey. Really glad you're here with us. Before I dive into my welcome and opening remarks, I just want to let everybody know that we're recording this Zoom meeting, so keep that in mind as we move forward. So hi everybody, I'm Ben again, and I'm really glad to have joined the team at Federation just a few months ago in August as a Chief Planning Officer. For those of you I haven't met yet, I'm looking forward to hopefully meeting you in person sometime soon. In the meantime, just a word of introduction about me. My background is my career until I joined Federation was all in Jewish day school education, most recently as the head of a school called Schechter Manhattan in New York City. And it's been just a great first few months for me at Greater Metro West. Incredibly warm welcome from colleagues and lay leaders and members of the larger community. And I'm really, really grateful to be here. And one of the amazing things I've gotten to be involved in right when I got started was this really special moment in the history of the Greater Metro West Jewish community, which is the release of the 2020 community study. And it's really exciting to have just released it last week. The purpose of the 2020 community study is to provide the Greater Metro West Jewish community with reliable information to help all of us, those of us at the Federation and also throughout the Jewish community, to better fulfill our mission, to care for people in need, to build a vibrant Jewish community. This sort of information hasn't been collected in the Greater Metro West Jewish community in over 20 years. So a couple of years ago, our Federation leadership invested in a state-of-the-art research study to learn more about ourselves. We contracted with the Maurice and Marilyn Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies at Brandeis University, which is a renowned multidisciplinary research institute dedicated to the study of American Jewry and religious and cultural identity. Like I said, the community study is hot off the presses, just released last week. Hopefully you've had a chance to take a look already. It's all available to everybody on our Federation website, and you can read all the reports there. And this evening, or it's evening for me where I am in Israel right now, I'm on a Federation trip, but in the afternoon in New Jersey, we're really happy to invite you to be a part of the conversation about the community study. We're really glad that Janet Aaronson, the lead researcher of the study, is here with us. She's going to share some details about the community study, along with a collection of key findings related specifically, we think, to areas of interest to synagogues. And then we'll have time for you to ask Janet your questions. So let me introduce Janet. Janet Aaronson is the Associate Director of the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies at Brandeis University. She earned her PhD in social policy at the Heller School for Social Policy at Brandeis. Janet has directed and contributed to local Jewish community studies in over a dozen communities, including recently the study of Chicago, and even most recently, our Greater Metro West study. Janet is also happy to be learning about her home community in Metro West New Jersey. She grew up in Union and is a proud graduate of what was, when she went there, called the Solomon Schechter Day School of Essex in Union, and now we know it and love it as Golda Ach Academy. And so we're really glad to welcome Janet back into our community to share how she went about the study and some of the key findings. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Janet.
Hi, everybody. So nice to be here. I'm going to share my screen so that I can present some of these data to you. Before I start, I'll just say I'm going to go through quite a bit of data in a short amount of time. My purpose here today is not so that you can have a test on every number that I present, but it's really to show you the range of information that's available if you look in the reports. Try to highlight some of the newer conceptual work that we did, and then generate some conversation that I hope we'll have in the second part of the hour today. So with that, I'm going to just start with, those were sort of my framing comments. I just want to say a couple of words about framing for as you read the reports and what to think about and the purpose of the study. In every report, there are a lot of numbers, and it's really easy to get hung up on what percent of this group did this particular behavior, or what percent of this other group feels a certain way about Israel or the community. And what I encourage you to think about is don't get hung up so much on the numbers. Every number is an estimate, And I'll talk for a moment about why. But what's really interesting is to look at the patterns and looking at the meaningful differences between numbers. For example, how do younger people feel about the Jewish community compared to older people, or people in Essex compared to people in Union County? Those are really the driving questions that I hope will help you think about the numbers in the study, finding the story behind it. And what's really most important is to look at the opportunities in it. This is merely a description of the community. It's not a judgment. It's not proscriptive. It doesn't tell you what to do, but it sort of sets up where some interesting pockets of people who are engaged, highly engaged, less engaged, engaged in different ways. And the idea is to generate some conversation about how the Jewish community might serve their needs. A brief word about methodology. And again, the purpose of this is just to give you some framing about how to understand the work. The study is based on surveys of over 3,000 respondents. It was conducted between October and December of 2020. So of course, this year of all years, this is very important to think about the timing of the study and the fact that we were collecting data during the COVID pandemic. Right before, we were actually all geared up to start the survey before then, and we pressed pause on it to rethink what to do, what was the best time to launch it, and as well, to modify some of the questions and the language to account for things that, like, people would not be behaving in their usual ways, people would have different concerns, and really to capture the expansion of online Jewish life. The other thing to keep in mind is that that's a large number of survey respondents, over 3,000. And the response rate was 33.4%. That is relatively high. And for those of you who know the Pew response rate, it's actually around the same number of respondents, even though that's about the whole Jewish population. And their response rate was about 17%. People were selected from lists, which many of you provided to us, from purchased lists of people in the area who we thought might be Jewish. And because we have this large number of respondents, that allows us to drill down and provide information about smaller groups. The 4 different regions, people with different characteristics within each region. Generally, it doesn't allow us to go down to the zip code level and say, how many conservative Jews live in this zip code in Livingston? But there is more that we can learn, and that's one thing that we can talk about in terms of during the Q&A is where can we go for more. I'm going to start with some key findings about the whole study to frame the conversation, and then I'm going to return to information that's specific about Jewish engagement in synagogues. So the first is the size of the Jewish community, and even when we say the size, these are estimates. There are a lot of numbers here because there are a lot of different ways to think about the community. The first number, over 122,000, is the number of Jewish people in Greater Metro West. And they live in almost 57,000 households, where Jewish households are defined as a household that includes at least one Jewish adult. But of course, many people in Jewish households are not Jewish. So if you think about the broader Jewish community as everyone who lives in a Jewish household, that is 155,000 people. A brief word about definitions. Jewish adults are defined as people who identify as Jewish. It could be that Judaism is their religion. It could be they consider themselves Jewish culturally or ethnically. It could also be that they consider themselves Jewish and another religion. In addition, they have to have some Jewish background, which we define as either they have at least one Jewish parent, they were raised Jewish, or they converted to Judaism. So that's Jewish adults. With Jewish children, it's a little bit simpler. It's if their parents consider them to be Jewish, so do we. Those are Jewish children. A brief look at what's the catchment area. What is the map? You can see this large area. This is Union County, Essex County. Here is most of the eastern, sort of the eastern part of Morris County, and then everyone else, the rest of Morris County, and the rest of the catchment area. Each dot on this map represents about 25 households, and don't zoom in too close and try to count households, but it's the idea is to show you where's the density, and you can see just from looking at this map, if you can see up closely, the density of Jewish households in this area in Essex, almost as much in Union, even though it's a little less, no Jewish households in Newark, that's this part. And you can see what we've called Greater Metro West is much less, even though it's a much larger area, there are many fewer Jewish households distributed over that area. Few other just overview comments about the community. Well, we talk about household composition as is sort of expected in a primarily suburban community. About 3/4 of households include a couple. When we say couple, we always mean married or partnered. And 80% of adults are married or partnered. About 1/3 of them are intermarried, and that is quite a bit less than the national number, which is 42%. Just to sort of use this opportunity as a caution, when you're reading the data, we talk about Jewish adults, we sometimes talk about Jewish households. It causes some confusion, but we need to do that for a variety of reasons. So if you look at numbers and they don't really make sense, make sure that you're looking at carefully at the title and the heading, so you know what we're talking about. Of Jewish children, about the same number of Jewish children are being raised by intermarried and in-married parents, and a small number, 8%, are being raised by single parents. Another area of concern to the community is financial status. I draw your attention to the second set of numbers, not the income per se, but we ask basically subjective, what is, how do you describe your financial status? 15% of households say they're just managing to make ends meet, and 2% say they cannot make ends meet. We put these groups together and say the 17%, we call them financially struggling, and we talk about them quite a bit throughout the report. And one thing that's noteworthy in terms of COVID is that we found here, along with throughout the United States, households that were financially struggling before were the hardest hit by COVID. And a lot of families who were doing well before continue to do well, but if they were worse off, they are even worse off now. So now I have that sort of overview, some points about the study as a whole, and I'd like to move on into Jewish engagement in general, and then I'll talk about synagogues specifically. Again, I'm going through it fast. Feel free to ask questions at the end. Denomination, our most familiar measure of Jewish engagement. This is how people describe themselves. This is not what kind of synagogue they're in. This is just how they label themselves. And we can see that 4% of Metro West Jewish adults are Orthodox, and that's seems to be a lot less than national. But here's a place where I would caution you that these point estimates, these are just estimates, and they're not all that different from each other. I would not want you to take away that Metro West has half as many Orthodox Jews as the rest of the country. But what I do want to draw attention to, which is a big story in Jewish denominations in the United States, is that largely increasing group of Jewish adults who do not identify with any particular denomination. That's about 1/3 of all US Jewish adults, and 38% of those in Metro West, Greater Metro West. About half of them describe themselves as secular or culturally Jewish, and the other half as just Jewish. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit later about this group and how we can understand their Jewish engagement, which we should not simply understand as unaffiliated or unengaged. To help us understand that, we've developed a new model for describing and thinking about Jewish engagement. This is something that we provide for all of our community studies, but they are developed uniquely so that the information here, the labels, the groupings are unique to Greater Metro West. What we take is a set, and I'll just move forward to about 20 different Jewish behaviors, including things you do at home, like have a Seder or light Hanukkah candles, what we think of more ritual behaviors, attending services, fasting on Yom Kippur, marking Shabbat, being involved in Jewish organizational life, including belonging, donating, attending, and individual behaviors, the things you do at home, seeking out news about Israel, reading Jewish publications that you don't need an organization for. And we take these behaviors and we use a statistical method to group people according to what behaviors do they do the most. And from this group, we've developed from this analysis, we've developed 5 groups of patterns of Jewish engagement, Jewish life in Greater Metro West. So we can see on the right, 14% of the Jewish adults are in what we call the immersed group. And you can see these numbers that's color-coded are mostly dark. Almost everybody in that group does almost everything, all of those activities. On the other hand, we have people we call minimally involved. That's 16% of the community. They do almost nothing in these top sections, but of the things they do, they are individual behaviors, things that they could do on their own at home. And in the middle, we have 3 other groups. About a quarter of Jews are in what we call the familiar group. They also do these personal things, but as well, most of them have a Seder, most of them light Hanukkah candles. So we call them the home activities. In the personal group, another quarter of people, they do those, but all of them do these individual things. So their Jewish life is based at home. It is not based in organizations. The involved group over here does many of the things that the immersed group does, but in the immersed group, everybody does almost everything. In the involved group, a little bit less so. So we're going to talk more about what these groupings mean. But here's one way to look at it, is what is the difference between that typology and denomination. And I want to draw your attention to the Orthodox row and the no denomination row. So we'll start with the no denomination row, which I said was more than a third of Jewish adults. And you might think, boy, they don't do anything. But of those people in the no denomination group, only a quarter of them are in the minimally involved group. A third of them are in the familial group. A third of them are in the personal group. And some of them are even in the involved and the immersed groups. So what we could see is that no denomination does not fully explain, it does not imply lack of Jewish engagement. Among Orthodox Jews, we might expect that all of them are in the immersed group, but in fact, they're not all in the immersed group. Some of them are in the personal group, and their Jewish life is also mostly at home. Now, some of that might be due to COVID, and some of it might be because although they call themselves Orthodox, they're not participating in sort of Jewish ritual life the way other Orthodox Jews do. Here's another way to look at this Jewish engagement. It corresponds highly with attitudes about what does it mean to be Jewish. So we asked this question, this is sort of our baseline question, to what extent is Judaism part of your daily life? And we could see that in the immersed group, almost everybody says it's part of their daily life. The personal and involved group, even though they have very different Jewish behaviors, their answers are exactly the same. And the minimally involved and the familial are much less likely to think that Judaism is part of their daily life. Okay, I'm going to move right on to the synagogue stuff, which I know you're waiting to hear. Synagogue membership. We found that 29%, just under a third of households, are members of any kind of synagogue, congregation. We use it very broadly. About a quarter are dues-paying members what we call brick and mortar synagogues. We still haven't come up with a better name for that, but it's what you think of with a building, clergy, and a dues structure. That rate of synagogue membership is a little bit less than national, but almost the same. Of those households, this shows the breakdown of the type of synagogues. 13% are Orthodox, 40% conservative, essentially the same, essentially conservative and Reform are the same. Attendance at synagogues. This is the responses to question in the past 6 months. Have you attended a religious service? And we included in person or online. About half of Jewish adults said they never attended in the last 6 months. And you can see the distribution of the other half. About 71% said they never attended any kind of synagogue-sponsored program aside from services in the past year. This also may be a COVID effect. In many communities, we actually see that there are a fair number of people who attend programs, although do not attend services. And this just information we collected, which is already now out of date, but I think interesting to guide for the future about for people who attended a high holiday service in 2020, what are they looking for in the future in terms of in-person and online services? And you can see that we can expect online services to be popular well into the future. Looking at some of these differences by that Jewish Engagement Index, you can see that in the immersed group, almost everybody is a synagogue member, almost everybody attends services at least once, and almost everybody attended a high holiday service. You can see that it varies. Involved group, also similar, high numbers, but not everybody. The personal group kind of in the middle, and these two other groups much less for all of those. But what's noteworthy in all of these groups, more people attended services than are members of synagogue. So one question is, where did they attend services, and what does that mean? Differences by region, and you can see that there's a wide range. In Essex and Union, synagogue membership is relatively high, much less in Morris, and even less in Western Greater Metro West. But here again, you can see that in all cases, synagogue service attendance is higher than synagogue membership. A word about is this a financial effect? What you can see here, and I highlighted these numbers to show that this difference is statistically significant, and you'll see this in the report. A lot of the numbers are shaded, and that means that there is a real difference. In other words, it is actually true that well-off people are more likely to be synagogue members than people who are financially struggling or in any of these other groups. But these are not highlighted. So even though the numbers are a little bit different, in fact, people, regardless of their financial situation, everybody is attending services at the same rate. Marital status, I think we would expect to see differences, that in married households, much more likely to be synagogue members, much more likely to be to attend services, and much more likely to attend high holiday services. This group of non-married member, in some communities, we think of that as young singles, but this is, also older people, never married, widowed. So this is the whole group of people who are not currently married. Last piece of information, of course, Jewish life is not just about synagogue life. So this just provides some information about some of the other Jewish behaviors we measured. Hanukkah and Seder, as is true nationally and with every other community, those are the top two Jewish behaviors. And fasting on Yom Kippur actually generally is higher than attending services. This marking Shabbat includes, did you light candles or have a special meal? And the smallest one is keeping kosher at home. So that is what I have for you today, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you so much, Janet, for that overview and explanation of how the study works and the types of questions we can ask. So we're going to move to a Q&A now. We're going to collect questions in the chat, and I'm going to moderate. So if you have already started thinking of questions, please, feel free to put them in the chat now. As you're doing that, a couple of words about what we can do in this Q&A. So please do offer us questions about any of the data that Janet shared and any of the slides that she shared today. Also, if you've had a chance to read through the reports and you have any questions about specific aspects of the report, especially if you could say, oh yeah, it's in this particular report and it's this particular data point I'm asking about, those are all great questions and Janet can help clarify. But it's a massive data set, and as amazing a researcher as Janet is, we do not expect her to have memorized it. So questions that say, what is this particular statistic about this particular group? We can't expect Janet to just pull that off the top of her head. So again, questions about anything she shared today or any specifics from the reports are really helpful. And if you could just put your questions in the chat, we'll do our best to address them. We'll give everybody a moment to submit questions that are on your mind.
Can I respond to, while we're waiting, can we respond to that first comment from Rabbi?
Yeah, sure, go for it, Janet.
So I think, look, it's a great observation, the differences between the groups, keeping in mind that the groups are actually created based on people's behaviors. So in other words, it's because people were always attended services that they kind of got into the immersed group. And the involved group are the group who sometimes attend services. So I think, keeping that in mind, that it's these behaviors create the definitions of the groups, but the real value of it is to think about what are the patterns of Jewish engagement, and that there are some people who are highly engaged who sometimes attend services, and sometimes some people are highly engaged who always attend services. And so I think that that's a useful way to think about it.
Thanks. I don't see any questions coming through the chat, so please feel free to put them through while we're waiting. Janet, one question we've gotten in other conversations we've had is about, are these numbers the same or different than what we expected or other information we've had in the past? Do they reflect any trends? Maybe you can comment on that. Okay,
sure. So we did not really focus on comparisons to the 1998 study. That was the previous one, for a number of reasons. One is the geography changed. And two is that the method of defining who is Jewish changed. There are a lot of differences that don't make them apples to apples. But most of the reason is a lot has happened since 1998 in the world. And I think, to attribute any change to, specifically one cause or one initiative that, that the Greater Metro West initiated, we can't really do that. There are too many changes over the time. So I'd focus on this one. Where we can, we offered comparisons to national trends. And I think in some places, because I've looked at a lot of these studies, I noted where things are kind of interesting. I would say that the most unique characteristic of the Greater Metro West community is due to the geography. And it's the fact that it's a primarily, it actually is an only suburban community. There is no, like as with many places, there's no sort of city center where the Jewish life is concentrated in one place. There are many places that it's concentrated and looks differently. And because it's primarily suburban, does not have a lot of young adults. Most of the young adults are living in their parents' home. They're not single people living, wherever and working. So, there are a lot of interesting differences. So if we do comparisons to other communities, it's really important to think about why.
Thanks, Janet. That's really helpful. Great. We have a few questions that came through. A couple of them are about that index of Jewish engagement. Rabbi Schwartzwald, we can bring that slide up again, but I want to point out to you where you can find it yourself to look at it your own time. It's in the report titled Jewish Engagement, and you can find that exact chart right in there and take your time to go through it when you'd like. And I think you're asking the types of questions that we're all trying to think about, which is, what does this mean, right? We have the data, and this is the beginning of a conversation, right? We're looking now what this said, this study that Janet and her team led, but you're asking the next question, which is, what do you think it means? And if we figure out what we think it means, what might we want to do about it? Another question about the Index of Jewish Engagement was, if you could share, Janet, a little bit more detail about who's in that personal profile.
Okay. So I appreciate those questions. In the report, this is something I don't have off the top of my head. We have a lot of information about the demographics of people in the different groups. So their ages and where they live. I mean, I had to show the region, but where
Janet,
they live. And so
I want to clarify my question. I don't think the question was about all those other demographic details,
okay.
Just more about understanding what are the Jewish behaviors and activities that got them into that category.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And I'm also, okay, I'm going to actually bring up the slide again. And while I do that, I want to also respond to the comment, which is bigger question, which is, what do you do with this? And, how do you think about Jewish engagement for these different groups? And I think that is the number one question, and that I'd love to be really digging into with all of you. I don't want you to come away thinking that this is a ladder of Jewish engagement, and our goal as a Jewish community is to move people across the ladder from the low engagement groups to the high engagement groups. Some of you might feel that way, and I respect that, but that's not how this was designed or intended to be used. Think that the way that I think is most valuable to think about is, this is a snapshot of how people are engaging in their Jewish life now. And so we'll look at this personal group, because the question is, the reason why people got in the personal group, the reason why we named it personal, is because all of them are doing these individual activities. They're talking about Jewish topics with their friends. They're following news about Israel. They're reading Jewish publications on their own. They're engaging with Jewish focused culture, which means I don't know if they're watching shtisel on TV or they're listening to Israeli music. We don't know exactly, but that's what they're doing. They're eating sort of what we call traditional Jewish foods, which almost everybody does. And then they're doing these home holidays, such as the Seder and Hanukkah. Now, the truth is, 2/3 of them are marking Shabbat at home. Half of them are attending services. So they're not doing these other things, but they're doing less of them than the other groups. But the thing that they are not doing is they are not joining organizations. Their Jewish life is at home and with friends. So I think the question I would love for you to take away and think about is, what does it mean to enhance Jewish life for that group, for people who are doing these things? Does it mean to tell them that you, the other 80% of you, need to join a synagogue or join a Jewish organization when you've already said you're not really interested? Or is the thing to do to say, great, you're doing these Jewish things at home with your friends and family. How can we make them more meaningful when you do that at home? What could you send them? What could you provide people to do at home so that their Jewish life, so that these activities are richer? And so I think that is maybe a different way to think about the question. Now, in the end, do you want everybody to join a synagogue? Do you want everybody to join a JCC? The why? Maybe. But I think starting with people, it's, this is a sort of cliche already, but meeting people where they are is the place to start, and enriching what they're already doing, rather than saying what you're doing is not what we would like you to be doing. So let's see how to push you to the next thing. So that's a bit of a soapbox, but I'm really passionate about that issue. And
Well,
I think
thanks,
that's the
Janet.
key. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, thanks. I appreciate that. And what I want to say about it is first, that it really helps us think about what are the types of questions we can be asking ourselves with this data. And to sort of restate what I hear you saying and what we've been thinking about as we've been looking at this data is, this, like you said, it's a snapshot and it's a description of the various ways that Jews in our community choose to express their Judaism and enact their Jewish lives. And understanding that amongst those ways is institutional membership, and there are also a whole bunch of other ways that they're enacting their Jewish lives that don't include that. And what's that's going to mean? What is that going to mean for us? I want to shift to another question that was put in the chat, which is, you mentioned, Janet, that this research was done during the COVID pandemic and that you paused and rethought. And so the question is, do you think that this pandemic affected the data, and in what ways? So maybe you can comment on that.
So yes, I think it did, but let me talk about in what ways and where it matters. So I don't think it affected the size of the population and the basic, where people lived. I think that there were probably some shifts because of the pandemic, but not large. I think that we've done a lot of other research about what was happening to Jewish life during COVID. And we found that online Jewish life mostly attracted people who were already engaged in Jewish life. So that with the exception of, let's say, Orthodox households who could no longer attend services in person and were shifting to online. Other than that, it was the people who were already doing things are doing different things, or some of them are doing more, but there wasn't a huge pivot from, people who were unengaged and now had this time on their hands. And they said they're going to go on and do lots of programs. So I think that was that. The financial situation, which I described, as mentioned briefly, that the people who are struggling, and we can see in a lot of places that is a barrier to participating in Jewish life, the barrier already existed, and now it's probably worse. But one of the slides I did not show you today, but it is in the report on community connections, is on what, and we asked people, what are the conditions that limit your connections to Jewish life? And one of the top ones was the pandemic. So they were not participating the way they'd like. But there are lots of other conditions that limit participation to Jewish life. The number one is not knowing enough people. And I think that was true before the pandemic. It certainly didn't get better during the pandemic. So I think that information as a guide to how to engage people more, that's going to be really, really valuable.
Janet, thanks for that. And I appreciate you pointing out some of the ways that things were the same or different. But maybe you can comment on, like, this report is a report on the steady state of our community and why you have confidence that it's accurate.
I have confidence it's accurate. Well, okay. So methodologically, I have confidence that it's accurate, and I'll tell you why. But the sort of conversations with people who know the community, it appears to be an accurate representation of the patterns we see in the community, of the differences in the different regions and different families. And I'd love your feedback about that. I'll just make a couple of methodological notes. These surveys are extremely hard to do. If you follow this work at all and you know about election polls and people not answering their phone to take surveys, it's a very difficult work. So we do a couple of things to make sure that it's accurate. One is that our estimate of the Jewish population itself does not only come from the survey, it comes from a synthesis of hundreds and hundreds of surveys that are done for other purposes about where there's a question, and a demographic question, what is your religion, if any? And we synthesize all those, and that's where we get our estimate of the Jewish population. And because it's from many sources, even if one is wrong, they all kind of balance each other out. The other thing is that we gathered from your synagogues and many other institutions, actual data. How many members do you have? How many children are enrolled in school? How many families get PJ library books, things like that. And our results are calibrated to match those numbers. So that's why we're really confident that the numbers reflect the reality. So I think that should help. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Janet. Yeah. And of course, we understand that this was the reality of COVID, but that those methods that you used to make sure that we were really getting good information that reflected what we know about the community are really, helpful for us to know about. So my colleague Bob asked a question about what we can learn about specific denominations. Can we say this denomination is involved in a particular sphere of Jewish community, or that denomination in another sphere of Jewish community? And that may blur into stuff that Janet doesn't know by heart, but maybe, Janet, it's an opportunity for you to talk about the power of the cross tabulation and really being able to dig into things across the subgroups.
Thanks. Right. So that is really the power of the whole study, is not to just look at what % of everyone does this, although that's valuable, but as I said earlier, to look at differences. We did not focus on differences by denomination for this particular study, but that's something that we can look at, and there is so much more data to dig into. Because we look at this Jewish engagement index, that's one of our main analytic tools. To kind of understand, as we said, it's richer because it's not just on one label. I think what you'll see is that the ritual behaviors are pretty much as you would expect. I mean, denominations well, and there won't be any surprises. One of the things that I have found from looking at other studies is to look at within synagogue members, and just in some places we look at the difference between, let's say, people who say they're conservative and are members, like the difference between the denomination that you describe yourself and your synagogue membership. Those are not a one-to-one correspondence. And the other thing is that among conservative, reform, and no denomination groups, there is a wide variety of Jewish practice, organizational practice, and individual behaviors. But remember that they're also influenced by your family status, whether you're married, whether you have children, your income, where you live. So there are a lot of factors that go in, and that's the rich analysis.
Thanks, Janet. So there's one comment in here that I think will be a good segue to my sort of wrapping up. If there are any last questions, let's make sure people get them in the chat so that we can attend to them. But the conversation earlier about the personal and the large numbers of personal and familial in our community who are engaging in Jewish life in ways that don't include synagogue membership, and the concern that brings, especially to our friends and members of the Jewish community who know how important synagogues are to us and who want to grow them and strengthen them, and a worry that COVID time has actually made that even more difficult because people feel safe at home and have had all of these other ways of engaging in Jewish life. Even people who want to engage outside of their homes can have had all these virtual options they didn't have before. But of course, we know there's a large group that before COVID and during COVID are choosing to engage with Judaism in personal ways. And I think that those sort of deeper questions, that next level of what does this mean and what do we want to do about it, that sort of leads us into, where we're going with all of this. This is the beginning of a set of conversations, thinking about what the data means and what we want to do in response to it to strengthen our community. So at the Federation, we're doing the same work. Our lay leaders, our professionals are working in partnership to bring together trends from across the community study reports and to start identifying priority areas for attention and exploration based on the data. And as we do that, you can expect to hear from us. We'll share what we think and what we're working on as we proceed in the weeks and months ahead. And we invite you, we encourage you to have the same conversations in your communities and in your synagogues, and as they relate to the realities of the challenges and opportunities that you're facing and that come out of your read of the data. As you do that, we're here to be in partnership with you. If you have additional questions about the data as they arise, if you want to dig into some aspects of the study, please feel free to be in touch with me directly. I'm happy to help you find yourself some of the data that's already out there, and if there are questions that's not already in our reports, to see if we can figure out together the best way to get to some of those answers. I also want to remind everybody that Sarah Siegel, my colleague at Federation, is always available to support you in your work and in connecting with the community of the whole larger Jewish community of Greater Metro West, but especially the network of synagogues in our Federation area. And I want to say thank you. I thank you to all of you for what you do to lead your synagogue communities. Thank you for being in partnership with us in strengthening the Greater Metro West Jewish community. For all of the different data points, my personal, as a sort of a newbie to Greater Metro West read of this stuff, is that we have a rich and vibrant Jewish community in Greater Metro West, New Jersey. And there's a lot to be excited about and a lot of opportunities for us to work together towards a bright future. So with that, I'm gonna let you all get back to the rest of your busy days. Thank you again. Thank you, Janet, especially for leading this and answering the questions. Thanks to my colleagues behind the scenes at Federation who have put all the Zoom stuff together. And toda rabba, hitraot.